Go ahead. If you are so brave, just leave. My sister challenged me, her voice dripping with venom, telling me I would not survive a single week without them. I did not scream or cry. I simply placed the keys to my apartment and the family credit card right there on the Christmas dinner table, smiled at my shocked parents, and walked out into the freezing Atlanta night. By the very next morning, they were in an absolute frenzy. My phone blew up with 68 missed calls. What they did not know was that overnight, their precious multi-million-dollar empire had officially collapsed, and I was the one holding the match. Before I share exactly how I burned their fake world to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that severely underestimated your worth. I am telling you this now from the quiet of my own living room, seated with one leg crossed over the other, in a deep velvet armchair, a glass of red wine resting against my fingertips. The Atlanta skyline glows beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and there is something almost absurdly peaceful about looking down at a city where my family once believed I could not survive without their permission. A week ago, the only room they thought I belonged in was whatever room they assigned me. Tonight, I own the silence around me. That contrast matters because the Sterlings were experts at appearances. Christmas at the Buckhead Mansion was never simply Christmas. It was a performance. My mother adjusted candles before guests arrived because the photographs had to look right. My father discussed commercial projects loudly enough for people in adjoining rooms to hear. Iman selected outfits as if every dinner were a society page photo shoot. And Spencer behaved like the family empire had been waiting for him specifically, as though marrying my sister had somehow transformed him into the architect of everything my parents built before he ever arrived. At dinner, he kept dragging the conversation back to his newest commercial project. Every time I tried to answer one of my father's questions about market risk or financing, Spencer cut across me with another boast. He talked about leverage as if he had invented debt. He talked about banks as if chairman personally waited for his calls. He described construction timelines with the confidence of a man who believed volume could substitute for competence. My parents rewarded every interruption. Marcus laughed too loudly at Spencer's jokes. Valerie refilled his bourbon herself, even though staff were standing nearby. Iman watched her husband speak with the satisfied expression of someone displaying an expensive acquisition. Each little gesture carried the same message. This was the person they believed represented success, and my job was to sit quietly at the far end of the table and be grateful for proximity. I had spent years learning not to react. In forensic accounting, you do not accuse a company because one number feels wrong. You wait. You observe. You compare what people say with what their records prove. So I watched Spencer perform. I watched my parents applaud him. And I noticed how often his confident stories changed when anyone asked for a specific number. That night, I still did not know the full scale of what he had done to Sterling Heritage. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man calling me a glorified bookkeeper was terrified of anyone who knew how to read the books. Growing up in a wealthy African-American family in Buckhead meant our lives were a constant, exhausting performance. My parents, Marcus and Valerie, built a lucrative real estate firm called Sterling Heritage, and they wore their new money success like heavy armor. Our sprawling mansion was less of a warm home and more of a meticulously crafted stage set designed purely to show off their flawless lives to the rest of the Atlanta elite. Every piece of furniture, every holiday party, and every conversation was carefully curated to project power and perfection. And the undeniable star of their never-ending show was always my older sister Iman. At 32 years old, Iman was the undisputed golden child of the family. She held a completely useless vanity title as the executive director of the family business, spending her days shopping, getting expensive spa treatments, and attending high society luncheons. But more importantly, she had secured the ultimate prize my status-obsessed parents coveted. She had married a wealthy, well-connected white man named Spencer. To my parents, Spencer was the golden ticket to circles and elite country clubs they could not easily access, and he knew it entirely. He paraded his privilege around our house with a sickening sense of entitlement, treating my parents' wealth as his own personal playground. I was 29, the quiet younger sister who had supposedly failed to live up to the grand family name. I was a forensic accountant, a highly specialized job that my family ignorantly viewed as glorified basic bookkeeping. They had absolutely no idea that I was also a managing partner at Z Capital, a massively successful private investment fund I had built entirely from the ground up. I kept my true wealth and power a total secret, letting them believe I was just a low-level employee, barely scraping by in a small apartment officially owned by the family business. It was so much easier to fly under the radar than to deal with their constant jealousy, impossible demands, and toxic comparisons. But that fragile illusion shattered completely during our annual Christmas dinner. The massive mahogany dining room table was practically groaning under the weight of my mother's extravagant holiday feast. Crystal glasses clinked, and the room smelled of expensive catered roasted duck and imported pine candles. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, sipping my red wine, completely exhausted from a grueling 70-hour workweek at my actual firm. Instead of a warm family gathering, the dinner quickly turned into the usual platform for my parents to worship Iman and Spencer. Spencer was holding court at the head of the table, loudly boasting about his latest commercial development project. He leaned back in his velvet chair, swirling his expensive bourbon, and looked down his nose at me with a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. So Zora Spencer drawled his voice loud enough to intentionally silence the entire room. Are you still playing with spreadsheets in your little cubicle downtown? I hear the accounting department at your firm is doing a secret Santa. Did you get anything nice, or is your budget too tight this year to participate? I took a slow, measured breath, determined not to let him get under my skin. I am a forensic accountant, Spencer. I track massive financial fraud for corporate clients. It is a bit more complex than just playing with spreadsheets. Iman rolled her eyes dramatically, reaching over to pat Spencer's arm with a loud sigh. Oh, leave her alone, honey. Zora just likes to sound important. Not everyone can handle closing $50 million real estate deals like we do. It is perfectly fine that she prefers crunching numbers for other people's money. We cannot all be executives. My mother Valerie chimed in right on cue, her tone dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. Iman is right, Zora. There is absolutely no shame in being a simple bookkeeper, but you really should learn how to network better. Spencer could introduce you to some of his friends in the financial district. You know, white-collar professionals who actually make the big decisions. I bit the inside of my cheek, taking another sip of my wine to wash down the bitter taste of their disrespect. If they only knew that my investment firm had recently acquired the debt of 3 major developers in their beloved financial district, they would choke on their expensive dinner. They viewed me as a pathetic charity case, a socially awkward outcast who needed their guidance to survive in the real world. Every word out of Spencer's mouth was a calculated insult designed to make him look bigger by making me look incredibly small. And my parents, blinded by their obsession with status, sat there and smiled eagerly, participating in the humiliation of their own daughter just to appease their arrogant son-in-law. The tension in the room was thick, but I kept my composure, silently watching as they reveled in their false superiority, completely unaware of the financial storm that was about to hit them. The clinking of crystal glasses and forced laughter in the dining room finally faded as the catered plates were cleared away. But instead of moving to the living room to exchange gifts, like a normal family, my father signaled for me to follow him. He led the way down the long, dimly lit hallway to his private study. It was a heavy oak-paneled room that always smelled of expensive cigars and intimidation. My mother, Iman, and Spencer trailed right behind us, shutting the heavy double doors with a loud and final click. There was no festive holiday music playing in here. The atmosphere shifted instantly from arrogant celebration to cold and calculating business. My father took his seat behind his massive mahogany desk, folding his hands together while looking at me with a stern expectation. He did not bother with any holiday pleasantries. He got straight to the point, explaining that Sterling Heritage was expanding and Spencer was spearheading a massive new commercial real estate development downtown. To get the project off the ground, Spencer needed to secure a $10 million commercial loan from a major bank by the end of the week. But there was a glaring problem. Spencer had horribly mismanaged his previous investments, and his current financial portfolio was completely bleeding cash. Any bank underwriter in their right mind would take one look at his debt-to-income ratio and laugh him out of the building. That is exactly where they expected me to step in. My father looked me dead in the eye and casually instructed me to adjust the company financial records. He wanted me to artificially inflate Spencer's profit margins, hide his massive liabilities under dummy accounts, and sign off on the falsified documents using my official credentials. They were literally asking me to commit federal bank fraud and wire fraud, all to fund Spencer's fragile ego and salvage his failing vanity project. I stood there in the center of the room, looking at the four of them. They stared back at me with expectant, highly entitled expressions, completely unbothered by the fact that they were asking me to risk a federal prison sentence. I took a very deep breath, keeping my voice dangerously calm, and told them absolutely not. I explained clearly that what they were asking for was a serious felony. I told them I would never put my accounting license, my professional career, or my personal freedom on the line to cover up Spencer's financial incompetence. The second the word no left my mouth, Iman absolutely lost her mind. She lunged forward, her perfect high society facade crumbling into pure and ugly rage. She started screaming that I was nothing but a bitter, deeply jealous loser. She accused me of trying to sabotage her perfect life simply because I was miserable and alone. She pointed her manicured finger right in my face and shouted that I was just furious because I could never land a powerful, wealthy white husband like Spencer. According to her twisted logic, my refusal had absolutely nothing to do with the law or my personal ethics. She claimed I was just a pathetic, lonely outcast, desperately trying to ruin the happiness of the golden child. She said I resented her because she had secured the ultimate prize. A man who gave our family access to elite country clubs and boardrooms we could never enter on our own. Spencer stood right beside her, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He did not even bother to defend the integrity of his project. Instead, he shook his head and muttered that I was acting like a hysterical amateur. He looked at my father and said he knew they should not have relied on a low-level desk clerk to understand high-level corporate strategy. He treated my refusal to commit a federal crime as if I simply lacked the intellectual capacity to understand the real world of wealthy real estate developers. His white privilege dripped from every single word, entirely confident that my parents would take his side over their own flesh and blood. I turned to my parents expecting at least a shred of reason or parental protection. But my mother Valerie stepped forward, her eyes cold and hard. There was absolutely no maternal warmth in her voice, only the ruthless tone of a woman protecting her social investments. She told me to stop being so incredibly dramatic over a few adjusted numbers. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust and delivered a speech I will never forget. She said this family put food in my mouth, clothes on my back, and a roof over my head. She reminded me that the tiny apartment I lived in was technically owned by the family business. She completely ignored the harsh reality that I had paid my own way through college working multiple minimum wage jobs while they bought Iman a brand new luxury car. My mother pointed to the door and issued her ultimate ultimatum. She said if I did not sit down at that desk and fix Spencer's loan documents right then and there, I was entirely cut off. Her exact words were that this family provides for its own, and if I refused to serve my brother-in-law, then this family no longer needed me. She told me to sign the fraudulent papers or pack my bags and get out of their property by morning. The silence that followed my mother's ultimatum was thick and suffocating. I stood in the center of that oppressive, cigar-scented study, looking at the four people who were supposed to be my family. I saw my father avoiding my gaze by suddenly becoming very interested in his polished leather shoes. I saw my mother, her chin raised in a posture of absolute unyielding authority, completely convinced that she had just won. I saw Spencer wearing a smug, victorious grin, enjoying the show as if my life were a cheap television drama. And I saw Iman, her eyes burning with the desperate, pathetic need to see me break, to see me cry, to see me beg for my rightful place in their glittering world. They fully expected tears. They expected me to crumble under the heavy weight of their rejection. In their minds, I was a frightened, dependent child who would rather commit a federal crime than lose their financial scraps and social approval. They had spent decades conditioning me to believe that my entire worth was tied to their validation. But I did not cry. My heart was not breaking in that moment. It was hardening into solid stone. The very last fragile thread of obligation I felt toward these people snapped completely, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant clarity. I did not say a single word. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the study. I heard the sharp, offended intake of breath from my mother, completely appalled that I had dared to turn my back on her while she was still speaking. Their rapid footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor behind me as they followed me down the long, winding hallway back toward the grand dining room. They were like a pack of wolves circling what they mistakenly thought was wounded prey, throwing out sharp insults and demands to try and force a reaction out of me. I ignored all of it. I walked directly over to the chair where I had left my handbag. The room still smelled of catered roasted duck and fading pine candles, a sickening, luxurious contrast to the toxic reality of the people standing right behind my shoulder. I opened my bag and reached inside. My mother snapped at me, her voice shrill with irritation, asking where I thought I was going. She forcefully reminded me that she had only given me until morning to pack my things and vacate the company apartment. She told me not to be dramatic and to go back to the study. Instead of answering, I pulled out the heavy brass keys to the apartment they constantly held over my head like a weapon. Next, I took out the sleek black corporate credit card my father had given me years ago for emergencies, a card I had never even bothered to activate. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, I dropped the keys onto the polished mahogany dining table. The metal clattered loudly against the expensive wood, the sharp sound echoing through the cavernous room and cutting off my mother's rant. I placed the credit card right next to the keys, smoothing it down with my thumb. I turned to face my mother, my voice incredibly calm, steady, and completely devoid of the fear she so desperately wanted to see. I told her I would not be needing until morning. I told her I was done. That was the exact moment Iman completely lost her mind. The sight of me walking away on my own terms, unbothered and unbroken, was vastly more than her fragile ego could handle. She needed me to be the loser. She needed me to be the dependent, helpless little sister, so she could feel superior about her own hollow life. Her face contorted with intense rage as she stepped forward, her hands balled into tight fists, her voice echoing aggressively off the crystal chandeliers above us. "Go ahead," she screamed, pointing trembling fingers at the door. "If you are so brave, just leave. I bet you will not survive a single week without us. You are absolutely nothing without this family's money. You will be crawling back here begging for our help the second reality hits you. You cannot survive out there alone." I looked at my sister, really taking her in. I saw her expensive designer dress, her perfectly styled hair, and the absolute panic hiding just beneath her furious expression. She was projecting her own deep, terrifying insecurities directly onto me. Iman was the one who could not survive without our parents' money or her husband's toxic validation. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, and she hated me because I possessed the key to walk out of mine. I did not shout back. I simply smiled at her. It was not a smile of malice, but of pure, unadulterated pity. I picked up my heavy wool trench coat from the entryway chair and slipped it over my shoulders, calmly tying the belt around my waist. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the grand foyer. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying a weak, pathetic warning, telling me that if I walked out that door tonight, there would be no coming back. I did not look over my shoulder. I reached out, grasped the cold brass handle of the heavy double doors, and pulled them open. The biting cold of a rare Atlanta winter frost rushed into the grand foyer, instantly washing away the suffocating artificial warmth of the mansion. I stepped out onto the grand stone porch, and the heavy doors clicked shut behind me with a final echoing thud. I stood alone in the freezing night, the icy wind biting sharply at my cheeks, and took the deepest, cleanest breath I had taken in 29 years. I had no car waiting for me. I had just walked away from my supposed home, and every safety net I was supposed to rely on. But as I pulled my coat tighter and began walking down the long, winding driveway toward the dark street, I did not feel an ounce of fear, I felt an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of absolute freedom. They genuinely thought they had cast me out into the cold to die. They had absolutely no idea that I was already holding the match that would burn their entire empire to the ground. I did not freeze that night. I hailed a premium black car service from the edge of their gated neighborhood and rode in perfect heated silence back to downtown Atlanta. I woke up the next morning precisely at 7. Brilliant winter sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my actual home, a 4,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking the glittering city skyline. I stretched out on my imported silk sheets, savoring the quiet peace that real self-made wealth provides. My family truly believed I was waking up in a cramped, outdated studio apartment owned by Sterling Heritage, crying over my lost allowance. They had absolutely no idea I owned the entire top floor of one of the most exclusive residential high-rises in the financial district. I walked into my massive marble kitchen and began grinding fresh espresso beans. That was when I finally picked up my phone from the counter. The screen was completely cluttered with desperate notifications. 68 missed calls, 42 text messages, 14 frantic voicemails. The barrage of communication had started around 2 in the morning and had not stopped since. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I just smiled watching the screen light up yet again. The caller ID flashed Spencer's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the visual proof of his mounting desperation before calmly pressing answer. I did not offer a polite greeting. I just raised the espresso cup to my lips and listened. For a moment there was only heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. When Spencer finally spoke, that arrogant, condescending tone of white privilege he had wielded like a weapon just hours ago was completely gone. His voice was strained, frantic, and bordering on hysterical. He did not sound like the elite, untouchable real estate developer he pretended to be. He sounded like a cornered rat. I demanded to know exactly what I had done to the company servers. His words tumbled out in a panicked rush, explaining that he had been trying to log into the Sterling Heritage primary financial portals since dawn to finalize the underwriter documents for his massive commercial loan. But the entire network had walled him off. He said the bank executives were breathing down his neck, threatening to pull the $10 million funding entirely if they did not receive the verified digital ledgers by noon. When I did not immediately respond, Spencer tried to revert to his usual bullying tactics. He raised his voice, shouting through the speaker that he was going to call the police. He threatened to have his high-priced corporate lawyers sue me into absolute oblivion for severe corporate sabotage. He screamed that I was a bitter, vindictive child throwing a pathetic tantrum, and that my parents were preparing to destroy my life if I did not log in and fix the system immediately. I let him exhaust himself. I let him scream until his voice cracked, fully enjoying the soundtrack of his collapsing ego. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I spoke. I kept my tone incredibly flat, cold, and as sharp as cracked glass. I told him to lower his voice when speaking to me. I reminded him that just last night he had called me a low-level desk clerk. I asked him how a supposedly brilliant executive like himself could be brought to his knees by a simple bookkeeper. He started to stammer out another threat, but I cut him off instantly. I asked him, "Brother-in-law, did you somehow forget that I am the one who personally set up the encrypted security certificates for the entire corporate network?" The line went dead silent. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and I could practically hear the color draining from his face. I explained the part Spencer had never bothered to understand. The $10 million loan file was not frozen because I possessed some magical password to the entire company. Months earlier, Sterling Heritage had asked me to design the verification layer for high-value financial submissions. The bank required my digital certificate to validate the ledger package before an underwriter could rely on it. Christmas Eve ended that cooperation. The moment they demanded that I certify false numbers, I revoked my certificate from the pending loan workspace and preserved the audit trail. Routine company operations remained theirs, the fraudulent loan package did not. Without that certificate, the bank could still see the documents Spencer uploaded, but it could not treat them as independently verified financial records. His carefully inflated profit figures were now sitting in a queue marked unresolved. I told him that unless a legitimate reviewer certified the actual numbers, the underwriter had no basis to release the $10 million. There was no shortcut, no IT trick, and no screaming phone call that could turn fabricated revenue into verified capital before noon. Spencer began to panic, openly, his voice dropping into a pathetic, trembling beg. He pleaded with me to just log in for 5 minutes, promising that my parents would forgive me, promising that Iman would apologize, promising anything he could think of to save his own skin. It was deeply satisfying to hear the man who had mocked me in my own parents' dining room now practically weeping over the phone. I told him I did not want their forgiveness, and I certainly did not want their apologies. I told him to enjoy explaining his sudden, inexplicable lack of capital to his angry investors. I advised him to start looking for a good bankruptcy lawyer, because the house of cards he had built with my family's money was about to come crashing down on his head. I hung up the phone right as he started screaming my name, tossing the device onto the marble counter as I finally took a sip of my coffee. It was going to be a beautiful morning. After I ended the call, I finally opened the voicemail list. The first messages were still arrogant. Spencer ordered me to call him back. Iman demanded that I stop embarrassing the family. My father instructed me to remember who had given me opportunities. But as the timestamps moved closer to dawn, the tone changed. Commands became questions. Questions became bargaining. By the 68th missed call, they were no longer trying to punish me for leaving. They were trying to figure out how quickly they could make me come back. That progression told me more than any apology could have. They did not miss me. They missed access. I wrote the number 68 on a yellow legal pad beside my coffee and drew one clean line underneath it. Then I wrote the loan deadline noon. Below that, I wrote 3 words: do not interfere. I was not going to sabotage Sterling Heritage. I did not need to. I would simply stop protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. Spencer had built a financing request on manipulated numbers. My parents had chosen to support him. Iman had attacked me for refusing. If the truth was enough to collapse the loan, then the loan deserved to collapse. My phone lit up again. This time it was my father. The phone had barely stopped vibrating after Spencer's call when my father's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, then answered without greeting him. For several seconds, Marcus said nothing. I could hear my mother whispering in the background, telling him not to lose his temper, which almost made me laugh. The same man who had ordered me out of his house the night before was now carefully measuring every word because he needed access to the financial system he had mocked me for maintaining. My father began with authority. He told me that family disagreements should never interfere with business, that I was behaving recklessly, and that I needed to restore the digital certificates before the bank's deadline. I reminded him that I had refused to certify falsified numbers, and that refusal had not changed overnight. He immediately shifted tactics. The stern patriarch disappeared, replaced by the wounded father. He told me that blood was thicker than money. He said black families in Atlanta had to protect one another because the world was already waiting for us to fail. He accused me of humiliating my own parents in front of people who had spent years doubting Sterling Heritage. I listened in silence until he finally asked whether I understood what would happen to the family name if the $10 million loan collapsed. That was the moment I stopped him. I told him I understood the family name perfectly. I had spent 29 years learning exactly what it meant. It meant Iman's mistakes were called growing pains, while mine were treated like character defects. It meant Spencer could insult me at Christmas dinner and still be praised as a brilliant businessman. It meant my professional ethics were disposable the second his project needed fraudulent numbers. My mother's voice suddenly exploded through the speaker. Valerie had taken the phone from him. She told me I was being ungrateful. She said they had sacrificed everything to educate me, that every opportunity I had came from them, and that I was repaying their generosity by trying to destroy the company. She demanded that I remember who paid for college. That lie was so old that I had almost forgotten how much it hurt. I asked her whether she wanted to discuss college honestly. The line went quiet. I reminded her of the scholarship I earned during my first year, the one that was supposed to cover tuition and books. I reminded her that the money was deposited into an account my parents controlled because I was still young and foolish enough to trust them. Then I reminded her what happened next. The scholarship money disappeared, and within the same month, Iman received a brand new luxury car because my parents said she needed to look successful while networking with the right people. Valerie tried to interrupt, but I did not let her. I told her exactly what their generosity had looked like from my side. I worked mornings at a coffee shop before class. I worked evenings entering invoices for a small accounting office. On weekends, I took shifts at a hotel front desk until after midnight. 3 jobs while carrying a full course load studying for accounting exams on buses, and during meal breaks, saving every possible dollar for CPA preparation fees. I-Man drove to campus luncheons in the car, bought with money that should have paid for my education while I walked home in the rain because I could not justify the cost of a ride. My father came back onto the line and told me not to rewrite history. I told him I did not need to rewrite anything. Accountants keep records. I still had the scholarship statement. I still had the tuition receipts. I still had the pay stubs from all 3 jobs. Numbers had always been more honest with me than my family. The silence on the other end changed. It was no longer angry silence. It was the silence of 2 people realizing that the daughter they had trained to feel indebted had kept the receipts. Valerie tried one final approach. Her voice softened into the careful tone she used at charity galas when she wanted to appear compassionate. She said Iman was my sister. She said Spencer was my brother-in-law. She said families survive by making sacrifices for one another. She asked whether I truly wanted to be responsible for my parents losing the business they had spent decades building. I told her that refusing to forge financial statements did not make me responsible for anything. Spencer's losses were his responsibility. Their decision to protect him was theirs. Their decision to throw me out because I would not commit fraud was theirs. I was simply refusing to carry consequences that belonged to other adults. Then my father made the mistake that ended the conversation. He told me that if Sterling Heritage failed, the Black elite community would remember that I had betrayed my own people to protect a technical rule. I felt something inside me go perfectly still. I told him integrity was not a technical rule. I told him protecting a white son-in-law's fraud while demanding that his black daughter risk prison was not racial loyalty. It was cowardice wrapped in expensive language. I told him he had chosen Spencer's image over my future the moment he put those false statements in front of me on Christmas Eve. My mother started crying. I could hear it clearly now, soft and calculated at first, then louder when she realized I was not responding. She said she did not recognize me anymore. I told her that was because she had never bothered to know me. Then I ended the call. I blocked both of my parents' numbers before they could call back. For the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty about silencing them. I felt focused. Iman reacted before lunch. Her first social media post was a photograph of the Sterling Heritage Christmas tree, accompanied by a long caption about betrayal. She never mentioned the falsified loan documents. She never mentioned that my mother had ordered me out. Instead, she claimed I had been discovered stealing company money and had been removed from the family business for dishonesty. Within an hour, she posted again, this time describing me as unstable, jealous, and obsessed with destroying her marriage because I could not tolerate her success. She told anyone willing to listen that I had sabotaged Sterling Heritage's banking access out of spite. The comments multiplied quickly. People who had never spoken to me in their lives repeated her accusations as fact. Family acquaintances sent me judgmental messages. A few business contacts quietly asked whether there was something they needed to know. I could have fought every lie. I could have posted screenshots from Christmas Eve, published my credentials at Z Capital, and humiliated Iman before lunch. I did none of it. Public arguments create noise. Forensic accounting requires silence. While Iman performed grief for an online audience, I went into my home office and opened the encrypted archive I had been building for months. Sterling Heritage's irregularities had bothered me long before Christmas. Vendor payments did not match project schedules. Consulting invoices repeated with slightly different descriptions. Transfers moved through accounts that made no operational sense. I had never accused anyone because suspicion is not evidence. Now Spencer's panic over the locked loan package gave those old anomalies a completely different shape. I copied every record I was legally authorized to preserve from the systems I had administered: ledger exports, payment approvals, vendor records, pension fund movements, and the audit logs showing who had initiated each transaction. I did not alter a single file. I preserved timestamps, created verified backups, and stored read-only copies so nobody could later claim the evidence had been manipulated. Then I followed the money. 3 shell companies kept appearing between Sterling Heritage and supposedly legitimate vendors. The names changed across invoices, but the routing patterns did not. Funds left family projects, moved through layers of accounts, and disappeared offshore. One stream intersected with the employee pension fund. Another matched shortfalls Spencer had repeatedly blamed on construction delays. A third seemed designed to create the illusion that capital was still available, when in reality the same money was being moved in circles. I stared at the transaction map on my screen until the structure became impossible to deny. Spencer was not simply bad at business. He had built a system for draining the company while making my parents believe he was rescuing it. That discovery changed my strategy. The smear campaign no longer mattered. If I defended myself too early, I would warn him. If I publicly accused him without finishing the audit trail, he would start deleting records and shifting funds. So I let Iman keep posting. Every insult bought me more time. Every dramatic accusation convinced Spencer that I was distracted and emotional. By late afternoon, my phone showed hundreds of notifications. I muted them all. On one screen, my sister was telling Atlanta that I was a thief. On the other, the actual theft was arranging itself into columns, dates, account numbers, and signatures. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the evidence with the calm I always felt when a complicated fraud finally revealed its pattern. They believed they were winning because the loudest story online belonged to them. They had forgotten that the truth does not need to be loud. It only needs to be documented. I spent the next several hours turning those raw records into an evidence package that could survive hostile scrutiny. I matched invoice dates to project calendars and compared vendor addresses against corporate registration records. I traced pension transfers against the dates Sterling Heritage had announced supposedly strong quarterly results. The pattern was almost insulting in its simplicity once I stripped away the layers of presentation. Money was leaving real family projects, passing through shell entities, and returning in forms that made Spencer look liquid, while Sterling Heritage quietly absorbed the losses. What disturbed me most was how carefully he had hidden behind my parents' vanity. He knew Marcus wanted to look like an old-school patriarch who never questioned the successful white son-in-law at his table. He knew Valerie cared more about invitations, charity boards, and appearances than about reading a balance sheet line by line. He knew Iman would defend him because admitting the truth would mean admitting that the marriage she used to belittle me was built on exploitation. Spencer had not merely stolen money. He had studied every weakness in the family and turned those weaknesses into internal controls for his own fraud. I created a clean timeline. First came the unexplained vendor payments, then the transfers connected to the pension fund, then the growing pressure for the $10 million loan. Each step made the next one necessary. Spencer had created a hole, covered it with borrowed credibility, then demanded an even larger loan to keep the original theft from becoming visible. That was why my refusal on Christmas Eve had terrified him. The loan was not expansion capital, it was oxygen. I saved the completed timeline to an encrypted drive and duplicated it to a second secure location. Then I separated the documents into categories: pension activity, shell company transfers, false vendor expenses, banking access logs, and the loan package they wanted me to certify. I did not speculate beyond what the records proved. I did not need to. The numbers were devastating on their own. Iman posted another video while I worked. In it, she sat beneath our mother's Christmas decorations and told viewers that she was praying for me. She said the family hoped I would get help before my jealousy destroyed my life. The performance was so polished that I almost admired it. Almost. I watched exactly 30 seconds, then closed the window. My reputation did not need to be rescued that afternoon. My evidence did. That distinction was the difference between us. Iman needed people to believe her immediately. Spencer needed the bank to believe his numbers until the loan closed. My parents needed everyone in Atlanta to believe Sterling Heritage was still powerful. I only needed the truth to remain intact long enough to reach the right room. When I finished the final backup, I removed my hands from the keyboard and looked across the city from my penthouse windows. The family had spent the entire day shouting my name into phones and social media feeds, trying to drag me back into the role they had assigned me. I had not answered. Instead, I had quietly preserved the map of the minefield beneath their empire. And sooner or later they were going to step exactly where the numbers told me they would. Before closing the archive, I created a simple rule for myself. Nothing would leave my possession until it could be explained from beginning to end without emotion. Iman could call me jealous. Spencer could call me incompetent. My parents could call me disloyal. None of those words mattered if I could point to a transfer, the approval attached to it, the account that received it, and the next account that moved it again. I reviewed the pension activity twice, because that money belonged to people who had spent years working for Sterling Heritage. That was the line that made my anger sharpen into something colder. Spencer was not only stripping value from my parents. If the pattern was what it appeared to be, employees who trusted the company with their retirement security were being exposed to his greed as well. I did not post that suspicion online. I did not warn Iman. I did not call my father and give him another chance to choose me. I documented it. Every saved file made the social media noise feel smaller. By evening, Iman's accusations had spread further, but I had stopped checking the comments. Her campaign depended on speed and emotion. Mine depended on patience. That was when I noticed the next move forming in the records. Sterling Heritage had begun shifting attention toward a major commercial auction. The property they were targeting could be used as fresh collateral if they won it. Suddenly, the family's desperation made sense. They were not trying to grow, they were trying to hide the hole. I closed the laptop and smiled for the first time that day. If they wanted to move the fight into a public room full of serious investors, I was more than willing to meet them there. By the third day, the smear campaign had done exactly what I needed it to do. It kept their attention pointed outward, while I finished organizing the evidence inward. Eamon's posts were getting louder, but Sterling Heritage's cash position was getting weaker. Creditors were asking questions, the failed loan was still unresolved, and the shell company trail gave me a clear picture of why Spencer was becoming desperate. Then I saw the next move. The family was preparing to attend Atlanta's largest commercial real estate auction, hoping one new property could cover the old holes. I closed my evidence files and prepared to meet them there. To save their rapidly draining cash flow, my parents, Iman and Spencer, had to make a massive, highly public move. They attended the most exclusive commercial real estate auction in Atlanta, held in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. The plan they had cooked up was incredibly desperate, but entirely predictable. They intended to win the bid on a massive, highly coveted downtown commercial complex. Acquiring that specific property would allow them to leverage the new asset, secure a fresh line of credit, and essentially cover up the massive financial sinkhole Spencer had created in their corporate ledgers. It was a classic shell game, an attempt to move non-existent money around just to keep up appearances and keep the federal auditors off their backs. I arrived at the auction 30 minutes after the doors opened. I did not slip in quietly through a side entrance. I walked right through the towering brass double doors of the ballroom, and the energy in the room seemed to shift the moment my heels clicked against the polished marble floor. I was no longer the exhausted, overworked bookkeeper they were used to treating like absolute garbage. I wore a sharply tailored emerald green designer suit that fit me flawlessly, carrying myself with the absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who held all the power in the room. I spotted them almost immediately, near the front row of the bidding section. My parents were holding champagne flutes, flashing those practiced fake smiles at other wealthy developers. Iman was clinging to Spencer's arm, draped in expensive jewelry that was undoubtedly purchased with company credit. But beneath their polished high society performance, I could see the rigid tension in their shoulders. They were absolutely terrified of losing this bid. It took exactly 2 minutes for Spencer to notice me standing near the VIP registration desk. The smug, confident expression on his face instantly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated outrage. He whispered something harshly to Iman, and the two of them broke away from my parents, marching directly toward me across the crowded ballroom. Spencer was practically vibrating with anger, his face turning a blotchy red as he quickly closed the distance between us. He stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust. He actually tried to snap his fingers at a passing security guard before stepping directly into my personal space. He lowered his voice into a vicious, threatening whisper, attempting to intimidate me the same exact way he had in my parents' study just a few nights ago. He demanded to know how I had managed to sneak past the front desk. He leaned in, a nasty, arrogant sneer twisting his features, and told me that I needed to turn around and walk out the door right now, before he had me physically thrown out onto the street. He looked at my tailored suit, clearly assuming it was a cheap knockoff or a desperate rental, and laughed right in my face. His tone was dripping with that familiar, sickening sense of superiority as he leaned closer to deliver his ultimate insult. He told me that this ballroom was a highly exclusive space reserved only for the ultra-wealthy, not a gathering place for homeless, unemployed outcasts. I looked at Spencer, perfectly unbothered by his pathetic attempt at intimidation. I did not raise my voice or give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply adjusted the cuff of my emerald green blazer, smiled a razor-sharp smile, and smoothly stepped around him to take my seat near the middle of the ballroom. I knew exactly why they were so on edge. I kept this development secret from my family. After months of dismissive comments and jokes at my expense, I wanted to wait until something concrete materialized before sharing my progress. And today was the day the concrete had finally set. What he did not know would change everything. The registration desk gave me the first visible proof that Spencer's assumptions were about to fail. The auction staff did not question why I was there. They did not ask me to prove I belonged. They verified the letter of funds my investment team had submitted in advance, matched it to my bidder credentials, and handed me a numbered paddle with the quiet efficiency reserved for someone whose capital had already cleared every required check. From across the room, Spencer watched that exchange and still refused to understand it. I could see him trying to force the scene into a version that protected his ego. Maybe I was carrying paperwork for somebody else. Maybe I was assisting a client. Maybe the tailored suit was borrowed, and the VIP badge was temporary. Anything was easier for him to believe than the truth that the woman he called homeless had arrived with more verified liquidity than Sterling Heritage could assemble. My parents were doing the same thing. Valerie kept glancing toward me, then away, as if refusing to look could make me disappear. Marcus whispered repeatedly with Spencer while checking his phone for updates from the bank. Their problem was no longer simply winning a building. Their balance sheet had become a clock. Contractors were waiting. Creditors were calling. The failed $10 million loan had removed the cushion they expected to use. If they lost this commercial complex, they would lose the asset they planned to leverage to hide the hole. That was why I had come. Not to humiliate them for sport. Not to steal a project from under their feet. I had independently reviewed the complex through Z Capital before the auction, and the investment made sense on its own merits. Their desperation simply meant the same property had become two completely different things to us. To Sterling Heritage, it was camouflage. To me, it was an asset. That difference was about to cost them $10 million. I took my seat and opened the auction packet, refusing to look back at the family. The complex had strong tenants, useful redevelopment options, and enough long-term value to fit Z Capital's strategy. I had reviewed those facts before learning Sterling Heritage planned to bid. That mattered because I refused to confuse revenge with recklessness. If the property had been a bad investment, I would have let my family win it and destroy themselves without my help. But it was not a bad investment. It was simply one they needed more desperately than I did. That imbalance gave me the advantage. Across the aisle, Spencer kept glancing toward me instead of studying the packet in his lap. He was wasting energy trying to solve the mystery of my presence while I was calculating the only question that mattered: the highest price at which the asset still made sense for my fund. My father, meanwhile, was calculating survival. Those are very different calculations. An investor can walk away. A desperate borrower convinces himself he cannot. Before the auction began, I also watched how my parents interacted with the other developers in the room. Marcus shook hands too firmly and laughed too loudly. Valerie moved from group to group, collecting reassurance disguised as small talk. Every conversation was really the same question. Do you still believe Sterling Heritage is strong? That was the dangerous part of building a business around image. The moment doubt appears, you have to spend more and more energy convincing people that nothing is wrong. I had no such burden. Z Capital did not need the room to believe in me personally. Our capital position, underwriting discipline, and transaction history were already documented. I did not have to impress anyone with a story about who I was. The numbers had already done that work before I entered the ballroom. Watching my parents perform under pressure made something very clear. They had spent years teaching me that power meant being seen in the right places with the right people. My career had taught me something better. Real power is being able to walk into the same room without needing anyone's approval to make the decision you came there to make. So while Marcus searched faces for confidence, and Spencer searched for a way to control the narrative, I simply waited for the lot number to appear. That was all. The heavy brass doors swung shut, sealing the ballroom. The auctioneer stepped up to the grand podium, tapping the microphone. The room fell into a focused, high-stakes silence. The crown jewel of the auction was up next, a massive multi-block commercial complex right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a prime piece of real estate, but more importantly, it was the exact lifeline Sterling Heritage desperately needed. If my father and Spencer could secure this property, they could leverage it immediately, secure a fresh line of credit, and completely cover up the massive financial sinkhole Spencer had created in their corporate ledgers. It was their one and only ticket to salvation. The bidding started fast and aggressive. 5 million, 8 million, 10 million. I watched my father from a few rows back. Marcus was sweating through his custom-tailored suit. He raised his paddle, his voice carrying a forced authority that failed to hide his underlying panic. 12 million. A rival developer across the room pushed the bid to 14 million. My mother Valerie gripped my father's arm, her knuckles turning white. Iman sat frozen, her usual arrogant posture completely gone, replaced by the terrified realization that her lavish lifestyle was hanging by a very thin thread. Spencer leaned over, whispering frantically into my father's ear. Marcus swallowed hard, raising his paddle high into the air. $15 million. The auctioneer called the number out, scanning the quiet room for any counteroffers. The rival developer slowly shook his head and lowered his paddle. A collective breath seemed to release from my family's row. Spencer leaned back in his chair, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his pale face. Iman let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, patting her husband's knee. They honestly thought they had won. They thought they had successfully played their little shell game and saved their fraudulent empire for another day. The auctioneer raised his wooden gavel, going once, going twice. I slowly raised my numbered paddle into the air, my voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a clean blade. $25 million, paid in full, cash today. The entire ballroom gasped. Heads whipped around so fast it was a wonder nobody suffered whiplash. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed was absolute perfection. Every single wealthy developer, investor, and socialite in that room turned to stare at the woman in the emerald green suit who had just casually dropped a $25 million cash bid on a Tuesday morning, down in the front row. My family physically recoiled. My father half stood from his chair, his jaw practically hitting the floor. My mother clutched her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. Spencer's smug grin vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, breathless terror as he stared at me. Iman looked like she had just seen a ghost, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The auctioneer blinked, completely stunned by the massive jump in price and the bold declaration of an immediate cash payment. He adjusted his glasses, looking directly at my registration placard. $25 million is the bid, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing loudly over the microphone. Do I have any other offers in the room? Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The price was astronomical, completely blowing every other investor out of the water. My father sank back into his chair, his face entirely drained of color. He did not have $25 million. Thanks to Spencer, they barely had the 15 they had just offered. Sold the auction, resounding crack. Sold to the Z Capital Investment Fund. Congratulations to the managing partner Zora. The applause that erupted in the ballroom was deafening, but all I could hear was the beautiful sound of my family's world shattering into a million tiny irreparable pieces. I remained comfortably in my seat, slowly crossing my legs, and looked directly into my sister's terrified eyes. They had walked into this room believing they were untouchable royalty. But in a matter of seconds, I had outbid them, outsmarted them, and completely stripped them of their only remaining escape route. As the bidding climbed, I watched my father's posture instead of the auctioneer's hand. At 12 million, Marcus still looked controlled. At 14, the muscles in his jaw tightened. At 15, he hesitated long enough for Valerie to lean toward him and whisper something urgent. Spencer immediately followed with his own whisper, gesturing toward the projected property figures, as though enthusiasm could manufacture liquidity. They were not bidding from strength. They were bidding from fear. I knew the public information on Sterling Heritage. I also knew what I had seen in the internal records before leaving. Their margin for error was nearly gone. 15 million was not a confident investment decision. It was the number they had convinced themselves could postpone exposure. That was why I waited until the gavel was almost down. If I had entered at 16, they might have chased me upward out of pride. If I had traded $1 million increments with them, Spencer could have turned the room into another performance and pressured my father into a reckless escalation. I had no interest in theater for its own sake. I wanted a clean, decisive result. 25 million did exactly that. It was not random. Z Capital had completed the valuation work. The complex supported the price within our larger portfolio strategy, and the funds were already available. I was not gambling against my family. I was making a transaction I would have made, even if they had never entered the room. That distinction mattered to me. Sweet revenge only feels sweet when you do not have to destroy yourself to deliver it. The auctioneer asked for another bid. Marcus looked at Spencer. Spencer looked at the floor. Iman stared at me as if I had broken a law of nature. For the first time in my life, nobody at that table could order me to lower my hand. The room understood the meaning of my cash offer before my family did. A financed bid carries conditions. A fully funded cash position carries certainty. The auctioneer's posture changed. Other bidders stopped whispering about price and started looking at my placard. Iman looked offended, as though money itself had violated the family hierarchy by obeying me. Spencer leaned toward Marcus again, but there was nothing useful left to say. Matching 25 million would not be a bold statement. It would be financial suicide. Their original 15 million already depended on a balance sheet stretched too thin. The extra 10 would not rescue Sterling Heritage. It would expose it faster. My father finally understood that. His paddle stayed down. For years my family had mistaken restraint for weakness, because I did not compete with Iman at dinners, galas, or social events. They never understood that I was not afraid to compete. I simply refused to compete for things that did not matter. This mattered. The gavel fell once, and the entire mythology they had built around me changed in one sound. There was another reason I refused to make the auction personal. My family's collapse was not supposed to come from me overpaying for a building simply to punish them. It had to come from the weaknesses already inside Sterling Heritage. If they could survive only by winning one specific property at one specific price, then the business was already dangerously fragile. That was the part my parents never understood about leverage. It makes success look larger right up until the moment it makes failure move faster. I watched the room reset after my bid. People stopped seeing me as the younger Sterling daughter who had wandered into an elite auction. They started seeing the name on the bidder registration Z Capital. My family noticed the shift too. For the first time, the social status they worshipped was moving toward me without their permission. The heavy wooden gavel had barely finished echoing across the grand ballroom before the shock in my sister's eyes violently twisted into absolute panic. Iman completely lost whatever fragile shred of high society composure she had left. She shoved her way past a row of stunned, whispering investors, her expensive silk dress catching on a chair, but she did not even care. She marched directly toward where I was standing, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a desperate and manic energy. My parents tried to stop her. I saw my father reach out to grab her arm, his face pale and slick with cold sweat, but she yanked herself free. Spencer was frozen in his seat, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit signs. He looked exactly like a trapped animal realizing the cage door had just snapped shut. Iman stopped inches from my face. Her breathing was ragged, and the diamond necklace she was so proud of was trembling against her collarbone. She lowered her voice into a vicious, shaking hiss, completely unable to comprehend the reality unfolding right in front of her. She demanded to know whose money I was spending. She accused me of committing massive fraud, of stealing someone's identity, of sleeping with a wealthy backer, just to put on this ridiculous show. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest and told me I was nothing but a broke, pathetic dropout who lived in a company apartment. She said there was absolutely no way on earth a low-level bookkeeper could drop $25 million in cash on a downtown commercial complex. I did not back away. I did not raise my voice or give the surrounding crowd of wealthy Atlanta elites any reason to look down on me. I simply stood my ground, radiating the kind of absolute quiet power that old money respects and new money fears. I let her unravel. I let her project every single one of her deep, pathetic insecurities directly onto me, while the entire ballroom watched in captivated silence. When she finally ran out of breath, panting and staring at me with wild, desperate eyes, I took a single step forward. I leaned in very close, closing the distance until I could smell the expensive floral perfume she always bathed herself in. I kept my voice incredibly soft, pitching it so low that only she could hear the words I was about to say. I asked her if she really thought I just stumbled into this kind of capital by accident. I told her to use that fancy business degree our parents had bought for her and actually think for 1 second. I whispered that the Sterling Heritage Employee Pension Fund did not just evaporate into thin air because of a sudden, unpredictable market downturn. I told her that money did not just vanish. It was meticulously and deliberately stolen. I let those words sink in, watching her pupils dilate as the confusion in her eyes slowly morphed into pure horror. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I softly told her to go home and ask her perfect, untouchable, highly educated white husband exactly which offshore shell companies he had transferred her family's future into. I suggested she ask him about the 3 dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands that he had been secretly feeding for the last 18 months while smiling in her face and sleeping in her bed. I pulled back slowly, giving her the physical space to process the absolute destruction of her reality. The transformation was instant and brutal. All the arrogant golden child confidence physically drained out of Iman's body. Her face turned the color of ash. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She slowly turned her head away from me and looked back across the crowded ballroom, her eyes searching for her husband. Spencer had finally managed to stand up from his chair in the front row. He was trying to push his way through the crowd toward us, attempting to look like the protective, commanding executive he always pretended to be. But the illusion was entirely dead. His suit suddenly looked a size too big. His skin was pasty, and the arrogant smirk he always wore like a badge of honor was replaced by raw, unfiltered terror. He met Iman's gaze across the room, and in that split second of eye contact, she knew. She did not need to see my forensic accounting files or the encrypted bank statements. She saw the undeniable guilt written all over her husband's sweating, panicking face. He had used her. He had used my parents. He had drained their entire empire dry to fund his own secret accounts, and I was the only person standing in the room who had the power to expose him to the federal authorities. I picked up my designer handbag from the chair beside me, moving with slow, deliberate grace. The auctioneer's assistants were already walking over with the preliminary ownership documents for me to sign. I did not give my sister or her fraudulent husband another second of my time. I simply looked at Iman, offered her a small, polite smile, and told her she might want to hire a very good defense attorney before the end of the week. I turned my back on my family and walked away, escorted by the auction house management, toward the private VIP signing rooms. I did not look over my shoulder, as I heard my mother's voice shrilly calling out my name, begging me to wait. I did not flinch when I heard the sudden chaotic sound of Iman screaming at Spencer in the middle of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, demanding to know what he had done. The high society mask of the Sterling Heritage family had completely shattered in front of the most powerful investors in the city. They were ruined, their reputation was obliterated, and the best part was that I had barely even started. Iman's accusation about my money almost made me laugh because it revealed how completely she had absorbed our parents' version of me. In her world, wealth could only come from a husband, an inheritance she controlled, or a family company title. The possibility that I had built access to capital through expertise never entered her mind. So I did not explain Z Capital to her. I gave her something more important. I gave her a question. When I mentioned the pension fund, I watched her anger fracture. She had attended enough executive meetings to recognize the phrase, even if she had never bothered to study the statements. Sterling Heritage had repeatedly blamed the pension shortfall on market volatility. Spencer had assured everyone that the gap was temporary. Iman's face told me she remembered every reassuring speech. Then I told her to ask him where the money went. That was the first moment she looked at her husband, instead of at me. Spencer's reaction did the rest. He did not scoff. He did not march over and accuse me of lying. He went pale. His eyes moved toward the exits before returning to Iman. A guilty person can rehearse words, but panic writes itself across the body before the mouth catches up. I let my sister see it. For years, she had used Spencer as proof that she had won some imaginary competition between us. She praised his connections, his race, his access, his confidence. Now one whispered sentence had forced her to consider that the trophy she kept polishing might actually be the person robbing the display case. I did not stay to comfort her through that realization. The auction staff was waiting for my signature, and I had legitimate business to finish. Behind me I heard Iman say Spencer's name in a tone I had never heard before. Not admiration, fear. As I signed the preliminary documents, the applause outside softened into a distant murmur. I could still hear Iman arguing with Spencer somewhere beyond the private room. Her voice rose, then dropped. His answered too quickly. I did not need to hear the words. The question had been planted. That was enough. A good forensic investigation does not force every conclusion at once. You place verified facts where they cannot be ignored and allow contradictions to do the pressure work for you. Iman had spent years defending Spencer against anyone who challenged him. Now the challenge was coming from her own memory of missing funds, unexplained delays, and the panic she had just seen on his face. By the time I finished signing for the complex, my family's problem was no longer only financial. They had begun to distrust one another. The fallout from the Waldorf Astoria was spectacular and instantaneous. Word travels through the Atlanta real estate circles faster than a wildfire, and the news of Sterling Heritage failing to secure their anchor property sent their remaining creditors into an absolute frenzy. The banks they had been stalling for months suddenly wanted their money. The contractors they had been stringing along started walking off job sites. Their multi-million-dollar empire was bleeding out, and the vultures were already circling. Less than 48 hours after the auction, my father called a strictly confidential emergency board meeting at the Sterling Heritage executive offices. The glass-walled boardroom, a space my parents usually used to intimidate smaller developers, now felt like a pristine, soundproof tomb. I knew exactly what was happening inside that room because my firm was already monitoring every single move their corporate accounts made. My father, Marcus, sat at the head of the massive granite conference table, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 days. The proud, untouchable patriarch was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man, terrified of losing his precious social standing. My mother Valerie sat rigidly beside him, clutching her designer handbag, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The illusion of their flawless, wealthy African-American dynasty was crumbling, and they were completely desperate for a lifeline. That was exactly when Spencer made his final predatory move. I did not sit down with them. He paced the length of the boardroom, projecting the calm, authoritative demeanor of a seasoned corporate savior. He had completely recovered from the panic he showed at the auction. In his mind, he had found the perfect loophole to turn the disaster I created into his ultimate victory. He stopped pacing, unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, and placed a thick, legally binding contract directly in front of my father. Spencer leaned against the table wearing a mask of deep manufactured sympathy and offered to save the family. He told my parents that the market had entirely lost faith in sterling heritage. He reminded them that the public humiliation at the auction had destroyed their credibility with the major banks. But he, Spencer, with his supposedly pristine reputation and elite connections, could shield them from total bankruptcy. He proposed a massive, immediate capital injection to pay off their most aggressive creditors and keep the company afloat. There was, of course, a massive catch. Spencer was not offering a loan. He was offering a buyout. He demanded 51% of the voting shares. He wanted absolute, unquestionable controlling interest of the entire Sterling Heritage portfolio. And the cash offer he placed on the table was an absolute insult. He was attempting to buy my parents' life work for absolute pennies on the dollar, a fraction of what the company was worth, even in its current distressed state. It was a brilliantly disguised hostile takeover. Spencer painted himself as the devoted self-sacrificing son-in-law, claiming he was liquidating his own hard-earned personal assets just to keep my parents out of federal prison. He played the role of the benevolent white savior, coming to the rescue of a failing minority-owned business, deeply twisting the knife into my father's bruised pride. But the reality was that Spencer was maneuvering to swallow the remaining assets whole, legally pushing Marcus and Valerie entirely out of power and securing the family wealth solely under his own name. I, man willfully blind and desperate to maintain her illusion of high society. Royalty immediately started pressuring my father to sign the papers. Even after the massive red flags I had dropped at the auction about Spencer's offshore activities, she chose to bury her head in the sand. She could not handle the terrifying reality that her husband was a fraud, so she aggressively doubled down on his lies. She begged our father to just let Spencer take the reins, arguing that Spencer knew how to navigate the wealthy white financial institutions better than they did. She practically shouted that this was their only chance to save the family home and keep their country club memberships active. My mother, entirely driven by her obsession with status, chimed in with a trembling voice. She looked at my father with pleading, terrified eyes, telling him that they had no other choice. She said they could not bear the absolute humiliation of a public bankruptcy. She begged him to swallow his pride and sign the company over to Spencer, insisting that keeping the wealth within the family was all that mattered completely, ignoring the fact that Spencer was actively stealing it from them. Marcus sat in heavy, suffocated silence. The man who had once ruthlessly ordered me out of his house into the freezing snow was now completely paralyzed by his own making. He looked at the contract, his hands physically shaking. He knew the deal was a blatant robbery. He knew he was signing away his legacy, his power, and his dignity. But the terrifying fear of losing his fake polished image to the public was far stronger than his business sense. With a heavy, defeated sigh, my father reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out his expensive gold-plated fountain pen. He removed the cap with trembling fingers and slowly hovered the gold nib directly over the signature line of Spencer's predatory contract. He was mere seconds away from legally handing over the absolute keys to his kingdom to the very parasite who had poisoned it. Spencer stood right behind my father's chair, a sickening, victorious smile finally breaking through his mask of false concern. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated his way into a massive fortune and completely bypassed the financial trap I had set for him. But he was fundamentally wrong. Because right as the tip of my father's pen touched the thick, crisp paper of the contract, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung wide open. What made Spencer's proposal especially dangerous was not the percentage alone. 51% meant control. Once my father signed, Spencer could appoint management, direct asset sales, approve refinancing, and decide which creditors were paid first. Marcus and Valerie would still see the Sterling Heritage name on the building, but the company beneath that name would belong to the man who had helped empty it. Spencer understood exactly which fear to exploit. He never told them they were surrendering control. He called it continuity. He called it stabilization. He called it keeping the company in the family. Every polished phrase was designed to make my parents feel that accepting humiliation privately was better than suffering embarrassment publicly. Iman reinforced every lie because she needed him to be the savior. She kept pointing to the auction loss as proof that the market had turned against them. She blamed me for creating panic among lenders. She insisted that Spencer's money was their only path back to respectability. Nobody asked to see proof that his money existed. That omission was the entire trap. As my father's pen moved toward the signature line, Spencer's expression changed for just a second. The sympathetic son-in-law disappeared. What replaced him was hunger. He was not saving a company, he was preparing to consume the remains. My parents kept treating the decision as if they had only two choices: accept Spencer's offer or lose everything. That false choice was another advantage he had built for himself. He had helped create the emergency, then positioned himself as the only person capable of solving it. I could see the mechanism in the contract even before entering the room. Control transferred immediately. Oversight protections weakened. The language gave Spencer enormous discretion over distressed assets after closing. If Marcus signed, the family would not merely lose voting power. They would lose the ability to stop the man already draining the company from deciding what disappeared next. That was why timing mattered. I did not burst into the meeting when Spencer began speaking. I waited until my father had the pen in his hand. I wanted every person in that room to understand exactly what decision had almost been made and exactly who had encouraged it. The truth is more powerful when it arrives 1 second before the irreversible mistake. The heavy glass doors did not just open. They were pushed apart with a commanding, violent force that completely shattered the dead, suffocating silence of the boardroom. I walked in the sharp click of my designer heels echoing loudly against the polished marble floor, like the ticking of a countdown clock. I was no longer the discarded, overlooked daughter they had thrown out into the freezing night. I was the executioner, and I had come to collect exactly what was owed. I was not alone. Flanking me on either side was an absolute wall of untouchable corporate power. To my right walked my attorney, one of the most ruthless and highly feared corporate litigators in the entire state of Georgia. To my left stood two senior risk management executives from the exact same major bank that currently held the Sterling Heritage mortgage. They wore immaculate, dark-tailored suits, their expressions carved from stone, projecting an aura of absolute financial authority that instantly sucked all the oxygen right out of the room. The physical reaction from my family was instantaneous and beautiful to witness. My father jumped so violently that his expensive gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers. It clattered loudly across the granite table, leaving a thick, dark streak of black ink smeared right across the signature line of Spencer's predatory contract. My mother let out a sharp, offended gasp, her hand flying up to clutch her pearls as if my mere presence was a physical assault. Iman practically leaped out of her ergonomic leather chair. Her face contorted into an ugly, highly unattractive mask of pure outrage. She immediately started screaming, her voice shrill and echoing painfully off the glass walls. She demanded to know how I had managed to get past the lobby security downstairs. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at me and shouted that I had absolutely no right to burst into a classified executive meeting. Spencer stood frozen in his place behind my father's chair. The smug, victorious grin he had been wearing just seconds ago was completely wiped from his face. His pale eyes darted frantically between my calm, unbothered expression and the imposing legal and banking team standing right behind my shoulders. His arrogant white privilege, the invisible shield he had used to manipulate my family for years, was entirely useless against the team of high-powered professionals I had brought with me. My father slammed his hands down flat on the cold granite table, trying desperately to muster whatever fragile shred of patriarchal authority he thought he still possessed. He ordered me to get out of his boardroom immediately. His voice was shaking with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious anger. He shouted that this was private family business, that I had been officially terminated from the company, and that he would not hesitate to have me arrested for corporate trespassing if I did not turn around and walk out the door that very second. My mother quickly joined his side, her voice dripping with toxic venom. She told the banking executives that they needed to leave, claiming I was just a pathetic, attention-seeking, deeply disturbed child who simply could not stand seeing her older sister succeed. She actually tried to laugh a brittle, nervous sound, telling the lawyers that I had a history of mental instability and that whatever wild stories I had told them were completely fabricated. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical, deeply embarrassing shouting. I simply walked forward with slow, deliberate, and agonizing precision. This room belonged to me now, and they were just taking up my temporary space. I ignored my parents completely and stopped right at the center of the massive granite table, standing directly across from Spencer. I looked down at the contract he had tried to force my father to sign. I looked at the smeared black ink. It was the pathetic, deceptive piece of paper that would have handed him the entire family fortune for pennies on the dollar. I reached into the leather briefcase my lawyer was holding open for me. I wrapped my hands around a massive 500-page bound document. It was thick, heavy, and filled with thousands of hours of undeniable, legally binding proof. With one smooth, powerful motion, I lifted the binder and slammed it directly into the center of the table. The heavy, booming thud of the document hitting the solid granite cut off my father's shouting instantly. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. The entire boardroom fell into an absolute suffocating and terrified silence. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. I looked directly into Spencer's pale, sweating face. I kept my voice incredibly calm, pitching it perfectly, so that every single syllable carried the weight of a death sentence. I told him that his little corporate rescue mission was officially over. I turned my gaze to my parents, who were staring at the massive binder, as if it were a live explosive device waiting to detonate. I announced to the room that the document sitting on the table was not just a basic financial summary. I explained that it was a complete, exhaustive, and thoroughly certified forensic audit of the entire Sterling Heritage portfolio. It had been executed by my team at Z Capital and reviewed alongside the bank representatives standing behind me. I watched the color completely drain from Iman's face as I explained exactly what a forensic audit entailed. I told her that my legal and accounting teams had spent the last 72 hours ripping apart every single layer of their beloved company. We had tracked every single wire transfer, every hidden offshore escrow account, and every fake vendor invoice that had been generated over the last 3 years. I placed my hands flat on the cool granite, leaning slightly forward, taking absolute command of the space. I told my father that the men standing behind me were not here to negotiate alone. They were here because the bank had officially flagged the Sterling Heritage accounts for massive systemic fraud. I explained that the financial bleeding that had brought their company to the brink of total bankruptcy was not caused by a shifting real estate market, and it was certainly not caused by my refusal to cook the books on Christmas Eve. Spencer tried to speak. He opened his mouth, trying to stammer out a defense, trying to formulate one of his usual slick corporate lies to talk his way out of the trap. But his throat was completely dry. He looked at the banking executives, then at the thick forensic report, and realized with absolute crushing certainty that his carefully constructed house of cards had just been obliterated. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy had finally been cornered, and there was no amount of manipulation that could save him now. Ayman looked at the massive binder sitting on the table. She looked at her husband, seeing his sheer panic, and the gears in her head finally painfully started to turn. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her, destroying the fake high society illusion she had spent her entire adult life fiercely protecting. My parents stood frozen in place, the terrifying truth of their impending ruin washing over them. They had spent decades treating me like an insignificant, disposable asset. They had cast me aside to protect the very man who was actively destroying them. I did not give them a single second to recover from the shock. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick cover of the forensic audit, holding Spencer's terrified gaze, and prepared to expose every single one of his dark, miserable secrets to the people who had foolishly trusted him with their entire lives. I let my father threaten me with security until he ran out of breath. Then I looked toward the bank representatives standing behind me. Their presence was not decorative. They were there because Sterling Heritage's financial position had crossed the point where family explanations mattered. The numbers now belonged in a room where every claim could be tested against documentation. My attorney placed the briefcase beside me without speaking. I did not need a dramatic legal The forensic audit was stronger than theater. When the binder hit the granite, I watched each member of my family react to it differently. Marcus stared at the thickness of the report, calculating how much I might know. Valerie stared at the bank representatives, calculating who in Atlanta might hear about this. Iman stared at Spencer, calculating whether his reassurances still made sense. Spencer stared at the exits. That was the reaction I trusted most. I explained that forensic accounting is not about guessing who looks guilty. It is about reconstructing movement. Money enters somewhere, leaves somewhere, touches an account, receives an approval, generates a timestamp. Stories can be polished. Transactions are less cooperative. The binder in front of them did not contain rumors. It contained a sequence. And sequences are very difficult to argue with when every step has a date. I opened the massive binder slowly, deliberately, letting the thick, crisp pages fall flat against the granite table. The sound echoed in the dead silence of the room. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Spencer. He was sweating profusely now, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. I placed my hand flat on the open page and began to read his absolute destruction into the official record. I started with the rescue contract sitting right in front of my father. I pointed to the exact clause where Spencer had graciously offered to buy 51% of Sterling Heritage for $12 million. I looked around the room and asked a very simple question. I asked them if they had ever wondered where Spencer was suddenly getting $12 million in liquid cash. My father blinked, his face ashen, unable to process the question. My mother clutched her designer handbag tighter against her chest. I answered the question for them. I told them Spencer did not have $12 million. I told them Spencer did not even have $12,000 to his name. I turned the page of the binder and slid a series of highlighted bank statements directly across the table toward my father. I explained that Spencer was entirely broke. His personal accounts were completely drained. He had leveraged himself into absolute oblivion years ago. But more importantly, the $12 million he was currently offering to save the family business was not his money. It was theirs. The banking executive standing behind me nodded in grim, silent confirmation. I watched the realization slowly crawl across my father's face as I broke down the exact mechanics of his son-in-law's massive embezzlement scheme. I explained that for the past 3 years, Spencer had been systematically bleeding Sterling Heritage dry right under their noses. He had created 3 offshore shell companies, each positioned as a legitimate vendor or consulting counterparty. On paper, they appeared unrelated. In the transaction history, they behaved like parts of the same machine. Money left Sterling Heritage through one entity, moved through another account, and resurfaced under Spencer's control. I laid out the fraudulent vendor invoices he had submitted and approved. Millions had supposedly been spent on premium construction materials that were never ordered, and consulting work tied to developments that never advanced. The invoices created a believable business expense on the front end, while the transfers quietly moved company profits away from Sterling Heritage, layer by layer, quarter by quarter. Spencer used those shell companies to drain real cash while disguising the losses as ordinary operating costs. And now, in his ultimate act of arrogant, predatory greed, he was taking the very money he had stolen from them and using it to buy their company out from under them. He was charging them for their own stolen property. My father let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. It was the sound of a proud, status-obsessed man realizing his entire legacy had been hollowed out by the white savior he had foolishly trusted over his own daughter. Marcus looked at the bank statements, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled against the granite. My mother. Valerie covered her mouth with both hands. Tears of pure horror finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. The pristine, wealthy African-American dynasty she had sacrificed her soul to protect had been nothing but a feeding ground for a parasite. Iman stood frozen next to the table. She looked at the documents, and then she turned slowly to look at her husband. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. She begged him to tell her it was a lie. She pleaded with him to say that I had fabricated the documents, that I was just trying to ruin their perfect marriage out of jealousy. She reached out to touch his arm desperately, needing him to maintain the illusion she had staked her entire identity on. But Spencer did not comfort her. The absolute finality of the forensic audit had stripped away his charming high society mask entirely. He realized there was no corporate loophole, no smooth excuse, and no legal maneuver that could save him from the federal banking executives standing in the room. The trap had closed tight, and the sudden crushing reality of imminent federal prison time caused his white privilege to violently curdle into explosive rage. He violently slapped Iman's hand away from his arm. The sharp physical rejection made her stumble backward, her eyes wide with shock. Spencer slammed both of his fists down on the conference table. His face was a dark, blotchy red, the veins bulging prominently against his neck. He abandoned his polished corporate persona completely and unleashed a torrent of vicious, unfiltered hatred. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a vindictive, miserable wretch. He cursed at me, his voice cracking with panic, completely unbothered by the presence of my high-powered litigator. My attorney simply took a single, intimidating step forward, his silent presence serving as a stark warning, but Spencer was too far gone to care. When he realized his intimidation tactics were entirely useless against me, he turned his wrath directly onto the family that had worshipped him. He looked at my father and laughed a cruel, ugly, desperate sound. He called Marcus a pathetic, gullible old fool. He mocked my parents for being so desperately eager to gain validation from the elite white business community that they practically handed him the keys to the vault. He told them it was the easiest scam of his entire life, because they were too blinded by their desperate need for social status to ever question a single financial report he handed them. Then he turned his sights on his wife. Iman was weeping openly, now the golden child completely shattered by the monster she had brought into our home. Spencer looked at her with an expression of such profound, naked disgust that it made the air in the room turn to ice. He called her a stupid, vacuous woman. He told her in front of her parents, her sister, and a room full of corporate professionals that he had never loved her for a single second. He verbally shredded her entire existence, stating that she was nothing but an incredibly convenient, tragically insecure mark. He mocked her desperate need to show off a wealthy white husband at her elite country club luncheons. He told her she was a hollow, empty shell of a person whose only value was her signature on the joint banking accounts he had systematically drained. Iman let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing wail, collapsing into her ergonomic leather chair and burying her face in her hands. The perfect, untouchable marriage she had constantly used to humiliate me was exposed as the most degrading, toxic fraud imaginable. Spencer straightened his suit jacket with violently shaking hands. He looked around the room, his eyes wild with the desperate need to escape the consequences of his actions. In his twisted, panicked mind, he thought he could still save himself if he severed all ties to the sinking ship. He looked directly at Iman and announced, his voice echoing loudly in the glass-walled room, that he was filing for divorce immediately. He declared that he wanted nothing to do with her or her ruined, bankrupt family. He shouted that he was walking out that door, calling his own lawyers, and washing his hands of the entire Sterling Heritage disaster. He actually believed that by divorcing Iman and walking away from the table, he could simply leave the wreckage behind and avoid accountability. He turned sharply on his heel and marched toward the heavy glass doors, fully intending to escape the corporate slaughterhouse. But the two senior banking executives did not move. They stood shoulder to shoulder, effectively blocking the only exit from the boardroom. Spencer stopped, his breathing ragged, demanding that they move out of his way. I remained at the center of the granite table, one hand resting on the forensic audit. I told Spencer that divorcing my sister would not erase a single transaction. The bank representatives had preserved the records and the audit trail for formal review, and the offshore transfers were serious enough to trigger a federal financial investigation. His marital status could change. The account history could not. The same wires invoices and shell company movements would still be attached to his approvals. For the first time, Spencer stopped trying to perform confidence. His shoulders dropped and the anger drained into something colder. He understood that walking out of the marriage would not let him walk out of the records. Whether investigators ultimately charged him was no longer a question he could control with charm status or a new story. He was leaving that room with scrutiny following him. I turned my attention away from the broken shell of my brother-in-law and looked back at my parents. They were holding on to each other, completely devastated, their entire worldview destroyed. They thought the absolute worst was over. They thought discovering Spencer's ultimate betrayal and the loss of their cash flow was the final nail in their coffin. But I had not brought my legal team here just to expose Spencer. I had come to address the sins of my parents, and the true financial checkmate had not even been played yet. I reached back into the leather briefcase my lawyer was holding and pulled out a single slender blue folder. I placed it gently on top of the massive forensic audit. The soft sound of the cardboard hitting the granite table made my mother violently flinch. I looked at my father and asked him a very simple question. I asked him if he remembered the exact terms of my grandfather's will. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He refused to make eye contact with me, his gaze dropping to the floor. I did not wait for his answer. I told the room that my grandfather, the man who actually built the foundation of our family wealth, was not a fool. He knew exactly how obsessed my parents were with high society status. He knew they would eventually burn through his hard-earned money just to impress people at their elite country clubs. So he did not leave his primary fortune to them. He quietly placed the bulk of his liquid assets into a secure blind trust. I took a slow, deliberate breath and dropped the ultimate revelation. I told my parents that I was the sole named beneficiary of that trust. Iman let out a choked gasp from the corner of the room, her tear-streaked face twisting in fresh disbelief. My mother closed her eyes, completely unable to bear the weight of her own guilt, a soft whimper escaping her lips. I slid the blue folder across the smooth granite so it rested right in front of my father. I explained that my team at Z Capital had uncovered exactly how Sterling Heritage managed to stay afloat during the real estate dip last year. They did not secure a legitimate commercial loan. They had taken out a massive, highly leveraged margin loan from the bank. And to secure that kind of high-risk capital, they needed pristine collateral. I kept my voice incredibly calm, pitching it perfectly so the banking executives behind me could hear every single word. I told my father that he and my mother had secretly pledged the assets of my grandfather's blind trust as collateral for their corporate margin loan. They had illegally leveraged a trust that belonged entirely to me. And to push the paperwork past the bank underwriters, they had blatantly forged my signature on every single page of the authorization documents. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of complete and total ruin. Forging a signature to secure a multi-million-dollar margin loan was a massive federal offense. I watched my mother begin to tremble uncontrollably. She opened her mouth, trying to stammer out a pathetic excuse. She tried to say they only did it to protect the family legacy, that they fully intended to pay it back once the market rebounded, that they never meant to hurt me. I raised my hand, instantly silencing her. I told her that her excuses did not matter anymore because the market did not rebound, and Spencer had stolen the money she intended to use to pay it back. I explained the harsh, unforgiving reality of their current financial position. I turned toward the two senior bank representatives behind me. The forged trust authorization had already been flagged during the bank's review of Sterling Heritage's distressed borrowing. That meant the collateral position could no longer be treated as clean, and the debt could not simply be rolled forward as though nothing had happened. The bank had moved the exposure into its distressed process and preserved the supporting records for whatever legal review followed. That was where Z Capital entered. 48 hours earlier, my fund had purchased the entire bad debt position from the bank. We did not erase the default or forgive the forged authorization. We became the creditor holding the claim. My father looked up at me, his eyes wide, completely uncomprehending. For a brief, pathetic second, a flicker of delusional hope crossed his face. He actually thought I had bought their debt to save them. He thought I was bailing them out. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on the cold granite table, completely shattering his final illusion. I told him I did not buy their debt to save their company. I bought their debt so I could be the one to officially destroy it. I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. I told him that as the primary holder of their highly leveraged fraudulent debt, I was officially executing a margin call. I demanded the immediate full repayment of the entire loan balance paid in cash effective this exact second. My father collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. He could not breathe. He grabbed his chest, his mouth opening in a silent scream of absolute defeat. A margin call on that massive amount of debt required immediate liquid capital that he absolutely did not have. Spencer had stolen it all. They were completely and entirely tapped out. I stood tall, radiating absolute unshakable power. I informed Marcus and Valerie that because they could not meet the margin call, Sterling Heritage was officially bankrupt. I told them that my legal team had already filed the paperwork. Every single corporate bank account was frozen. Every property in their portfolio was currently being seized. And the grand, sprawling Buckhead mansion they were so incredibly proud of was now legally under the control of my investment fund. Their entire empire, the fake glittering world they had sacrificed my mental health and happiness to build, was officially dead. And I was the one holding the smoking gun. Before I revealed the trust I gave my parents one last opportunity to understand what the audit had already shown about their own choices. Spencer had exploited them, but that did not erase their responsibility. They had ignored internal warning signs because confronting him would have threatened the image they preferred. They had treated scrutiny as disloyalty whenever the person asking questions was me. The blue folder changed the nature of the room. Until then, Marcus and Valerie could still imagine themselves as victims of a predatory son-in-law. The trust documents showed that they had also crossed their own line. They had not merely made bad investments. They had pledged property that was not theirs to pledge and used my forged signature to make the collateral appear authorized. My father's refusal to meet my eyes told me he remembered every page. I did not need to insult him. I simply walked through the structure. The trust identified me as the beneficiary. The pledged assets supported the margin borrowing. The authorization carried a signature I had never provided. The bank representatives confirmed that the debt was in default and that ownership of the distressed position had transferred to Z Capital through the purchase my fund completed. My mother whispered that they had intended to restore everything before I ever discovered it. That sentence summarized their entire moral framework. If the theft was eventually repaired, they believed the theft did not count. I told her intent did not create cash. Then I executed the margin call exactly as the debt position allowed under the deal structure they had signed. There was no dramatic countdown, no hidden button, no new trick. Just a contractual demand they could not satisfy because the money they expected to use was gone. Spencer had stolen their liquidity. They had stolen my authority. And now both decisions met on the same balance sheet. The bank representatives remained silent while I spoke because the documents did not require embellishment. My parents had spent years using family loyalty as a reason nobody should question them. Now the same paperwork they signed in private was being read back in front of professionals who had no emotional investment in their excuses. Marcus finally asked what I wanted. It was the first honest question he had asked me all week. I told him this was not about wanting the mansion humiliating Iman or proving that I was richer. The debt purchase was a business decision made after the bank offered a distressed position Z. Capital understood better than almost any outside buyer could. The personal history did not change the documents. It only meant I knew exactly how much denial had been built into the numbers. He asked whether there was any way to stop the margin call. I looked at the cash position in the audit and told him the truth. Not with money they did not have. The margin call also exposed the difference between ownership and appearance. My parents still had their names on plaques, letterhead, and property signs. Valerie still carried the same handbag. Marcus still wore the same watch. For the few minutes after I spoke, the physical symbols of wealth remained exactly where they had always been. But control had already moved. That was what terrified them. They had spent their lives believing that if the mansion looked the same and the company name remained on the building, then reality could be negotiated. Finance is less sentimental. A lender does not care how long your family has used a logo. A debt position does not care how many charity photographs exist of you standing beside influential people. When the obligations exceed the available liquidity and the creditor exercises the rights built into the agreement, image becomes decoration. I watched my father finally understand that distinction. He looked around the boardroom at everything that still appeared to belong to him and realized appearance was the only thing he had left. The company had not collapsed because I invented a new weakness. It collapsed because I stopped helping them hide the weaknesses already there. That was the final irony. The daughter they mocked for caring too much about details had survived because details were exactly what I respected. Contracts, signatures, approvals, and account trails had protected me better than family promises ever did. Their empire was built on people believing the performance. Mine was built on knowing what the evidence could support. The heavy reality of the margin call dropped onto the boardroom table, like a physical weight completely crushing whatever fight my family had left. My father, Marcus, the man who had spent his entire life projecting an image of untouchable financial supremacy, seemed to physically shrink right in front of my eyes. His broad shoulders caved inward. He let out a ragged, desperate sound that I had never heard before, a pathetic, broken sob that echoed horribly off the glass walls of the boardroom. The reality of losing his company, his commercial properties, and his beloved Buckhead mansion to his own discarded daughter was too massive for his fragile ego to process. He dropped his head into his trembling hands and began to weep openly, the gold watch on his wrist catching the harsh fluorescent light as he covered his face in absolute shame. My mother, Valerie, was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her impending social destruction. For decades, she had worshipped at the altar of Atlanta high society, sacrificing her own flesh and blood just to maintain her membership at elite country clubs and exclusive charity galas. Now she was staring at absolute, undeniable poverty. Her flawless posture collapsed entirely. She reached across the cold granite table, her manicured fingers grasping desperately toward me. The woman who had ruthlessly ordered me out of her house into the freezing snow just days ago was now completely unraveled. She begged me to stop the foreclosure. Her voice was shrill and high, cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. She pleaded with me to withdraw the margin call, crying out that we were family, and that family was supposed to protect each other no matter what. She tried to weaponize our shared history, swearing that they had made a terrible mistake trusting a white outsider like Spencer, that they had been blinded by his corporate lies, and that they would do absolutely anything to make it right. She promised to give me a permanent seat on the board, to publicly acknowledge my financial success at their next gala, to give me whatever validation I wanted, if only I would call off the federal banking executive standing right behind me. She wept bitterly, dark tears ruining her expensive makeup, begging me not to take their beautiful home away. I stood completely still, watching the woman who gave birth to me unravel into a desperate, groveling mess. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no sudden urge to comfort her. The deep well of empathy I used to have for this family had dried up years ago, completely drained by their endless cruelty, their constant comparisons, and their highly conditional love. Then the most spectacular and satisfying collapse of the afternoon occurred. Iman, the pristine golden child who had spent her entire 32 years of life looking down on me, finally broke. She had just lost her fraudulent, abusive husband, who abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. She had just lost her fake executive title and her luxury company car. And now she was losing the family wealth that funded her entire hollow, superficial existence. The sheer shock of her instantaneous total ruin caused her knees to literally buckle beneath her. She slid out of her ergonomic leather chair and collapsed directly onto the polished marble floor. My older sister, the woman who had screamed at me to leave the house, the woman who had mocked my career and publicly dragged my name through the mud on social media just to protect her own fragile ego, was now crawling on the floor. She grabbed the hem of my emerald green trousers. She looked up at me from the ground, her face a twisted red mask of pure agony and terror. She begged me for salvation. She sobbed so hard she could barely form coherent sentences, crying out that she had been horribly wrong about everything. She claimed she had always known Spencer was a greedy parasite, but she was too afraid to admit it to our parents. She pleaded with me to use my investment fund to save her, promising that she would change, promising that she would be the loyal, loving sister I always deserved. She groveled at my feet, her expensive silk dress pooling around her on the floor, weeping and begging me to give her just one more chance. She looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes and asked me how she was supposed to survive without the company credit cards, without her gated community, without the lavish lifestyle she was accustomed to living. I looked down at her. I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes, the complete destruction of her false superiority, and I did not feel a single ounce of satisfaction. I just felt profoundly tired of their endless, pathetic performances. I gently pulled my leg back, stepping out of my sister's frantic grasp. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored suit and looked at the three broken people weeping in the center of the boardroom. I kept my voice perfectly even, completely devoid of anger, malice, or vengeance. I told them that their tears and their apologies were completely meaningless. I explained that they were not sorry for how they had treated me all these years. They were only sorry that they had lost their money, their power, and their fake social standing. I reminded my mother of the exact words she had used in my father's study on Christmas Eve. I looked her dead in the eye and repeated her ruthless ultimatum back to her. I said she had told me that if I did not help Spencer commit federal bank fraud, the family no longer needed me. I reminded her that she had specifically ordered me to pack my bags and get out of her property by morning. I turned my gaze down to Iman, who was still weeping uncontrollably on the marble floor. I reminded my sister of her loud, arrogant challenge at the dining room table. I repeated the exact words she had screamed at me while pointing her finger in my face. I said she had told me to go ahead and leave if I was so brave. She had confidently bet that I would not survive a single week without their money. She had loudly declared that I was absolutely nothing without the family. I looked at all of them and stated the simple, undeniable truth. I told them I was not being cruel, and I was certainly not being vindictive. I told them I was simply honoring their wishes. They had asked me to leave, so I left. They had demanded I step out of their empire, so I stepped out. I had just taken the assets that legally belonged to me from my grandfather's trust and walked away exactly as they had instructed. I informed them that they were finally getting exactly what they had asked for all those years, a life completely free of my presence. The only difference was that this time, I was taking the foundation of their wealth with me. I told my parents they had exactly 72 hours to pack their personal belongings and vacate the Buckhead mansion before my firm officially seized the locks and changed the security codes. I did not wait for their response. I did not need to hear another desperate plea or another fake apology. I signaled to my attorney and the banking executives. We turned our backs on the crying, devastated family and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them to drown in the financial ruin they had so meticulously built for themselves. For several seconds after I gave them the 72-hour deadline, nobody moved. That silence was more satisfying than shouting could ever have been. My parents had spent my entire life controlling rooms through volume money and the threat of exclusion. Now none of those tools worked. Valerie tried to promise me access to the very social circles she had once used to measure my inadequacy. Marcus offered titles inside a company that no longer had the power to grant them. Iman promised sisterhood after years of treating me like a comparison she needed to win. Every offer came too late because every offer was still about what they thought I wanted from them. They never understood that freedom was the one thing they could not give me. I had already taken it when I left the keys on the Christmas table. 3 days later, the Buckhead mansion looked nothing like the palace my parents had used as a symbol of superiority. The driveway was crowded with moving boxes instead of luxury cars. Curtains had been pulled down. Display shelves were half empty. The rooms that once hosted carefully photographed holiday dinners echoed because most of the furniture had already been catalogued against Sterling Heritage's obligations. Marcus and Valerie left through the same front doors they had ordered me through on Christmas Eve. There was no audience from Atlanta high society waiting to comfort them. No parade of influential friends arrived to offer a guest house or a private loan. The people who had praised the sterling name at charity dinners suddenly became difficult to reach. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. The social network my mother had treated like an extension of family turned out to be exactly what I always knew it was: a marketplace built on perceived value. Once the value disappeared, so did the affection. My parents moved into a cramped rental apartment far from the Buckhead streets Valerie used to brag about. The place was clean but ordinary, with narrow rooms, shared parking, and none of the visual symbols she used to measure human worth. For the first time in decades, Marcus had no office suite, no company driver, and no sprawling property portfolio to point toward when introducing himself. He had to live inside the size of his actual financial reality. I-Man moved with them temporarily because the corporate accounts that supported her lifestyle were frozen. The executive title she had worn like a crown meant nothing without a functioning company beneath it. Her social media page, once filled with designer events and photographs of Spencer beside her, became almost silent. The same followers who had enthusiastically repeated her accusations about me did not rush to defend her when the truth about Sterling Heritage began circulating through business circles. Spencer's situation was worse. The forensic audit did not end when the boardroom meeting ended. The records involving the offshore shell companies, the diverted project funds, and the pension transactions were preserved for the financial institutions and the appropriate investigators. The FBI opened an investigation into potential financial fraud and money laundering connected to the transfers. Spencer was no longer presenting himself as the sophisticated outsider who could rescue a minority-owned family company. He was explaining why money entrusted to Sterling Heritage had moved through entities he controlled, while the company collapsed around him. I did not need to predict his sentence or invent an ending the process had not reached. The investigation itself was enough to destroy the shield he had relied on for years. Banks stopped treating his name like an asset. Investors stopped taking his calls. The expensive confidence he carried into Christmas dinner disappeared the moment every relationship around him became a question about records, transfers, and accountability. The Sterling Heritage reputation collapsed with him. For years, my parents had believed reputation was something they could manufacture through the right house, the right spouse, the right country club, and the right photographs. But reputation built on performance is fragile. Once the financial facts became impossible to ignore, every polished appearance from the previous decade was re-examined. People remembered how aggressively Marcus praised Spencer. They remembered Valerie presenting Iman's marriage as proof that the family had reached another social level. They remembered how easily my parents dismissed concerns whenever those concerns threatened the image they wanted to sell. I did not celebrate any of it publicly. I did not post photographs of the moving trucks. I did not respond to Iman's old accusations with a victory thread. I did not send my parents a picture of my penthouse or a copy of the auction documents. Their collapse did not need my commentary. The consequences were speaking clearly enough. One afternoon, I received a final voicemail from Valerie because she had called from a number I had not blocked. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. She did not apologize. Not really. She said the family had suffered enough and asked whether I could at least help them recover some of the properties so Marcus could rebuild Sterling Heritage under a new structure. Even after everything, she was still asking me to rebuild the stage. I deleted the message. That was the moment I understood that boundaries are not punishment. A boundary does not exist to teach another person a lesson. It exists to stop their lesson from becoming your responsibility. Marcus and Valerie had a roof over their heads. Iman was an adult capable of choosing what came next. Spencer had investigators and records waiting for him. None of those realities required me to step back into the role of fixer. I had already spent too many years repairing a family that only noticed my value when something broke. So I let the consequences remain exactly where they belonged, with them. The most striking change was not financial, it was silence. The family group chats that once exploded with demands, photographs, invitations, and criticism went quiet. There was nothing left to perform. No gala to dress for. No development announcement to exaggerate. No holiday table where Iman could use me as the designated failure so everyone else felt successful. I realized how much of their unity had depended on having someone beneath them. Without me in that role, they were forced to face one another directly. My parents could no longer blame my career for the missing money. Iman could no longer call my caution jealousy while ignoring Spencer's accounts. Spencer could no longer hide theft behind the family's obsession with appearances. The hierarchy that kept them comfortable had collapsed at the exact moment the money did. That was not something I engineered. I simply stopped volunteering to hold it up. I am back in my own living room now. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations is entirely gone, replaced by the quiet, undeniable peace of a life I built with my own two hands. I sit on my velvet armchair, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city lights glitter below me, a beautiful reminder of the real world that exists outside the toxic, microscopic bubble of Sterling heritage and Buckhead high society. I reach out and pick up my crystal glass, the deep red wine catching the city light. I take a slow, deliberate sip, letting the absolute silence of my penthouse wash over me. It has been exactly 1 week since that disastrous Christmas dinner. Just 7 days since I stood in my father's cigar-scented study and refused to break the law to save a man who actively despised me. They looked me dead in the eye and confidently told me I was absolutely nothing. My sister pointed her shaking finger at the front door and loudly dared me to walk away. She screamed that I would not survive a single week without their money, their connections, and their constant suffocating control. They truly believed I was a helpless, dependent child who would eventually crawl back to their doorstep the second reality hit. They were completely and fundamentally wrong. I did not just survive my week without them. I did not just endure the cold or scrape by on the absolute margins of their elite society. I became the exact spark that ignited the inevitable destruction of their entire fraudulent existence. I became the roaring fire that burned their meticulously crafted, profoundly fake empire down to absolute ashes. They handed me the match with their own arrogance and blind greed, and I simply did not hesitate to drop it. I watched the city lights glow and feel a profound sense of complete closure. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you certainly cannot grow while carrying the crushing weight of people who only value you for what you can do for them. I walked away from their toxic conditions, and in doing so I reclaimed my absolute power. From the smoldering ashes of their ruined legacy, I have built a fortress entirely my own. A castle secured not by lies, corporate embezzlement, or white privilege, but by my own intelligence, my own relentless hard work, and my own uncompromising integrity. I am completely free. Thank you all for listening to my story. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, if you have ever been underestimated, diminished, or pushed out into the cold, please remember one thing. Your worth is not defined by the people who are too blind to see it. Sometimes walking away is not a surrender. It is the ultimate victory. Stay strong, know your absolute value, and never be afraid to build your own empire.